that righteous anger guide you.
Back in 2020, Final Fantasy VII's Remake ending blew us all away and sparked plenty of conversation. But in spite of how good and genuinely surprising it was, it's fair to say that it was more than a little confusing. Funnily enough, Rebirth's ending follows the exact same pattern. Changes from the original game are even more prominent than the first installment of the trilogy throughout the experience, from beginning to end, but by and large, until its final chapter, Rebirth largely sticks to the same story beats. Its final chapters, however, head headfirst into Bonkersville and firmly plant their flag there. There's a lot going on as the game's story comes to an end, to the extent that it's hard to keep track of everything that's happening, which means some of the game's most crucial revelations might not be entirely clear to you, at least at first, and at least not for a while. To help speed that process along, here we're going to go through Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's ending blow for blow and explain everything that happens, and how it all sets up the third and final installment in the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. And of course, this should go without saying, but there are major spoilers ahead for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and the original Final Fantasy VII. If you haven't finished Rebirth, or if you don't want to go into Remake Part 3 knowing what happens in the original game after this point where Rebirth ends, turn back now. With all that out of the way, let's dive right in. Different timelines. So, welcome to the Final Fantasy VII multiverse. FF7 Remake's ending made it pretty clear that that's the direction this trilogy was headed in, and Rebirth hammers that point home. Right from its first scene, it resolves into one of the biggest lingering questions from the first game, confirming that the scene showing Zack Fair avoiding his tragic death and making it to Midgar alive with a Mako-poisoned Cloud, that scene is taking place in a different timeline. In this first timeline, Zack finds himself in a dying world where all of the planet's Mako has been sucked up, leaving it bone dry and on the edge of an imminent and inevitable death. On top of that, the only members of the main party who are still alive in this timeline are Cloud and Aerith, the former being Mako-poisoned and unconscious, and the latter in a coma, with Barret and Tifa having died during their escape from Midgar, and Red 13 having died afterwards in an attempt to protect Aerith from Shinra. Both Aerith and Cloud are in Aerith Mother's Elmira's care, and that's where Zack finds himself much of the time as well. Oh, and remember Biggs? Yeah, he survived in this timeline as well. But let's pause for a little bit and talk about how these different timelines even came to be. As Sephiroth explains towards the end of Rebirth, when Cloud and company defeat the Whisperers at the end of Remake, they inadvertently ended up creating multiple different worlds, or timelines, including the one where Zack survived. In fact, in its final act, Rebirth actually shows us more than two different timelines, though it isn't explicitly clear about it. At one point, where Zack is trying to decide whether to head to Reactor 6 to stop Biggs from bombing it, or to go to Shinra headquarters to try and get a cure for Cloud, that decision point splits timelines as well. Just as its predecessor did, Rebirth shows this only through images of Stamp, the Shinra dog mascot, who has a different look in each timeline, which means that you can miss out on a lot of crucial details if you aren't paying attention. From what we can tell right now, we see at least 4 different timelines. One is of course the main one where the party takes on Sephiroth. Then there are multiple involving Zack, one where he heads to Reactor 6 and one where he heads to Shinra headquarters, both of which end in his death. Then there's one where he heads to Aerith's flower patch in Sector 5 and takes on Sephiroth, which, for convenience, we're going to call Zack's main timeline. In fact, during the final battle with Sephiroth, Cloud and Zack's timelines even overlap briefly, allowing them to fight alongside each other for a short while. Meteor. You might be wondering, what the hell does all of this timeline stuff have to do with Sephiroth? What the hell does he even want? In the original Final Fantasy VII, it's pretty clear what Sephiroth is working towards exactly. He wants to use black materia to summon Meteor. When the meteor hits the planet, Sephiroth intends to suck up all of the life stream that will come leaking out to grow immensely in power. In Rebirth, all of those elements are still very much in place, and we'll go into that in a bit, but it turns out Sephiroth has larger things in mind. As many might have guessed since FF7 Remake came out, Sephiroth is very much aware of the presence of the multiverse and all of the different worlds. After all, he was the puppet master who manipulated Cloud to defeat the Whisperers at the end of the first game, and it was exactly that incident that brought all of these different new timelines into existence. And why did Sephiroth want that? Sephiroth's ultimate aim in Rebirth is to bring the whole multiverse back together into a single reality, a concentration of the multiverse. But how exactly did the Black Materia and Meteor fit into all of this? We know the former is still key to Sephiroth's plan, and we know he still intends to summon Meteor to destroy the planet. As Sephiroth explains, when a world or timeline dies, it returns to the planet's multiversal essence, which is essentially exactly how the lifestream functions, except on a much smaller scale. It only stands to reason then that the lifestream of a single version of the planet is going to seem minuscule in comparison to the lifestream of a converged multiverse. Presumably, Sephiroth intends to suck up these qualities of the lifestream to become a constant threat that even his world-ending plans in the original FF7 will seem tame by comparison. Aerith and the White Materia. Ever the yin to Sephiroth's yang, Aerith unsurprisingly ends up being the centerpiece of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's story, and, in particular, its conclusion. Whether or not she would meet the same tragic fate in the Remake trilogy that she did in the original game is a question we've all been asking for the last 4 years. After all, the party defeated the Whisperers and took the first step on the road to defying destiny. There's every chance that she survives. Right? As it turns out, no. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth toys with us, and ever so briefly makes it seem like Cloud is able to stop Sephiroth from impaling Aerith with his sword. But she ends up dying the exact way that she did in the original game, that iconic scene being recreated in devastating and heartbreaking fashion. Exactly how that transpires is left somewhat unclear. Whether Cloud hallucinates saving her, whether he glimpses into a timeline where he does save her, or whether he actually saves her, only for Sephiroth to manipulate reality and change things so that she ends up dying anyway. There really isn't a ton of clarity on this front. Our best assumption would be on the latter, though, because after she dies, Sephiroth seems to imply that the event, her death, scattered throughout multiple different timelines in the same form and laden with the same extreme emotions, acts sort of like a linchpin for him to grab onto multiple different worlds, allowing him to use his powers to force convergences between timelines on a much smaller scale than what he ultimately intends to do. Presumably, it is though these convergences forced by Sephiroth that Aerith ends up dying in spite of Cloud's efforts. Through them, that Zack and Cloud's timelines briefly overlap while they're fighting Sephiroth. Of course, before Aerith dies, her White Materia comes into play as well. In the original FF7, the White Materia is the ultimate foil to its black counterpart, and can be used to summon a spell that can protect the planet against Meteor. Aerith's attempt to summon it and stop Meteor end up bearing fruit after her death in the original game, though in the Remake trilogy, the White Materia appears in somewhat different fashion. Each time she interacted with the Whispers in Remake, her White Materia lost its powers and memories bit by bit, and by the time we get to Rebirth, it's little more than an empty, transparent glass ball. This is where the multiverse comes in again. Interestingly, there is at least one version of Aerith who is aware of the other timelines, of the importance of the White Materia, and of the fact that in our main timeline, Aerith's White Materia has died out. This version of Aerith pulls Cloud into her world and gives him the White Materia, and though Sephiroth arrives on the scene, he's too late, with Aerith shoving Cloud back into his own timeline, a fully powered White Materia in his grasp. Aftermath. In the aftermath of Sephiroth's temporary defeat and Aerith's death, there's still plenty that happens in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. For starters, the nature of Aerith's death seems to be much less conclusive in the Remake's trilogy than it was in the original game. It seems that her spirit has lingered on and that Cloud can still see her and speak with her. Red 13 seems to very faintly at least sense her presence at the end as well. But to the rest of the party, Aerith is well and truly dead and gone. Interestingly enough, it's not just Aerith's spirit that only Cloud is able to see. Right at the very end of the game, Cloud can also see a rift in the sky, something that the rest of the party sees no sign of whatsoever. This is, of course, the same rift we see throughout the game in the Midgar of Zack's timeline as well, signifying perhaps that our main timeline has now taken its first steps towards Sephiroth's multiversal goal. And why exactly is it that no one else can see Aerith's spirit of the rift in the sky? The rift, after all, is something that Zack can see as well. While we mentioned earlier, Red 13 seems to sense Aerith's spirit right at the end. So can Cloud see these things because he's traveled across timelines once? Which means they've now become fully visible to him. After all, that's how the Whispers functioned in the first game. Meanwhile, moving away from the main party, there are other noteworthy revelations to speak of as well, specifically where Rufus Shinra is concerned. One of Rebirth's new story additions is the role that Glenn Lodbrok plays. Glenn Lodbrok is revealed to be the de facto head of the Wutai government, and we find out pretty early on that he has some mysterious, nefarious plans in the works. In the shadows, he's working with Rufus Shinra, and together the two of them have fanned the flames for another impending war between Shinra and Wutai. At the end of Rebirth, however, Rufus is able to put the pieces together and comes to the conclusion that the war was just a means to an end, with the conflict's primary goal being to distract Shinra from Sephiroth. And why exactly is that? Well, Shinra is looking for the Promised Land as well, and Sephiroth obviously doesn't want that happening. As such, he uses Glenn Lodbrok, who, it turns out, is one of Sephiroth's minions, as his personal pawn to orchestrate a renewed conflict between Shinra and Wutai. Upon realizing this, Rufus Shinra guns down Lodbrok, though it is revealed that he's only killed a regular black-robed Sephiroth clone, whom Lodbrok had taken control of. We're guessing the supposed Wutai leader has been granted some special powers by Sephiroth at this point, but we're probably not going to find out for sure until Part 3 comes out. Speaking of which, what awaits in Part 3? At this point, given the fact that Aerith still ended up dying in Rebirth, it seems safe to assume that all of the larger story beats of the original game will still play out in the Remake trilogy. Of course, there will probably be loads added on top of those beats, but all of those crucial plot points from the backbone of the story are very likely going to show up again. Cloud still hasn't learned the truth about his past, which means Remake Part 3 will be where he'll learn about Zack's death in the main timeline, about the fact that he, too, is a Sephiroth clone. The weapons having a major role to play also seem like a safe bet. They were already pretty important pieces of the puzzle in Rebirth, and clearly the game sets them up for a much larger role in the third installment. Will we still be fighting against them as they go on a rampage throughout the planet as we did in the original game? Or is it one of those things that the Remake trilogy will look to change? We'd love to see how the boss fights against the weapons could look in a modern AAA game, so we're hoping we get the chance to take them on one way or another. Beyond that, with Cloud having fused the black materia to his Buster Sword without the rest of the party's knowledge, and Aerith's spirit staying behind in the Forgotten Capital to try and summon the spell and stop Sephiroth's meteor, the pieces are in place for the larger three-way conflict between Sephiroth, Shinra, and our heroes to hit a lot of the same notes that it did in Final Fantasy VII all the way back in 1997. The big wild card, however, is none other than Zack Fair. At the end of Rebirth, in his main timeline, he's very much still alive, and having fought Sephiroth alongside Cloud, he too has become aware of this other reality that exists outside of his own. His goal is to find a way to join these worlds again, but, of course, whether or not that would just be playing into Sephiroth's hands is the big question. And if that does happen, what will become of the versions of Aerith and Cloud in Zack's timeline? Clearly, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth answers a lot of questions raised by its predecessor, but at the same time, it raises many, many more. Above all, it makes it abundantly clear that the Remake's trilogy is going for a very ambitious grand plan that simultaneously retells the original game's story while also telling its own. Now, all we have to do is wait a few years to find out how it all ends. Hey, did you know that we at Gaming Bolt upload new videos every day? Stick around, drop a like, subscribe, and hit that bell, and let us know what kind of content you'd like to see in the future with a comment below.